2017 CF 15684, State v. Nelson. Mr. Nelson, you're going to be sworn in.
Do you solemnly swear the testimony you are about to give be the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, and nothing but?
I do.
Please state your full name and date of birth.
Scott Edward Nelson, February 28, 1964.
Thank you. Ms. Simmons, is the defense ready to proceed?
Yes, Your Honor. Ms. Moore will be calling the first witness this morning.
Ms. Moore, defense ready to proceed?
Yes, Judge. And Your Honor, I did file a couple of motions on Friday, and one yesterday that I emailed directly to the court and the state, but I have hard copies if you'd like them now.
Is this something we need to take up before the first defense witness?
No.
Okay.
But it would be after that.
Okay. You have hard copies. They were filed with the clerk?
Yes, they were e-filed, and then I emailed copies, and I have hard copies as well.
Okay. And yeah, for the state as well as, yeah, if you have copies, I'll
Yes.
take those. Thank you.
Can I approach?
Yes. Thank you. And who's doing cross-examination for the first witness for the defense?
I will, Judge.
All right, Mr. Nunley, stay ready to proceed.
You are, Judge. Thank you.
Ms. Morris, defense ready?
Yes, Judge.
Mr. Nelson?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, let's bring the jury, please.
Judge, we would ask that the expert witnesses be excused from the room to sit in the courtroom and observe.
I'm sorry, what was that?
We would ask that the expert witnesses be excused from the rule of sequestration.
Any objection, Ms. Simmons? Can you hold up the jury, please?
If I could just have a moment, we had done a little research on this issue before, and I just need to pull it back up. But at this point, we are objecting. Judge, I apologize. Like I said, we had brought this stuff up on, and then I'm just looking for it again. But it's our position that we're objecting at this point. It's not. There's no rule that allows that per se. I believe based on the case law, it's in the court's discretion. But it's our position that this is. The experts that the state is talking about, I assume, are Dr. Pritchard well, Dr. Pritchard, I guess, is the only one that I'm aware of.
Well, I guess that's a good question. Mr. Nunley, who are we talking about specifically?
We're talking about Dr. Pritchard, Your Honor.
Any others?
Not that we'll be testifying.
Okay. All right, go ahead.
Right, so Dr. Pritchard is is meant to rebut Dr. McClain's testimony. He's already been deposed, and any information that he learned while he was on the while Dr. McClain is on the stand is not something we would be able to then redepose him on and figure out if his opinions have changed. The case law suggests that if his testimony is going to be altered by watching a previous expert or witness testify, then that is not appropriate. And so I don't know what other purpose that it would be other than to potentially change his testimony, which we've already done a deposition on. So at this point, we would object, and we do recognize that it's not specifically allowed for in the rule, but the case law does seem to say that it's in the court's discretion.
Mr. Nunley?
Judge, the case law was held for many, many years that experts are excused from the room and are allowed to sit in the courtroom, hear the testimony of other experts, and to consult with counsel. That is what I am asking that Dr. Pritchard be allowed to do.
So in response to Ms. Moore's argument, Mr. Nunley, is your argument that if Dr. Pritchard remains in the courtroom, whatever it is he hears, although he may share privately with you for consultation purposes, it's not going to alter his testimony?
I do not believe that it would, Judge. I do not expect that it would. Well, let me put it this way. I have no reasonable expectation that his testimony would be altered by anything that Dr. McClain might say on the stand.
Okay.
I have no reason to think it would be.
And so what's the purpose for, is he going to sit at counsel table during the?
No.
Okay.
I would ask to have him seated and allow him to sit in the gallery where I can consult with him, if need be, privately with respect to cross-examination of Dr. McClain.
Ms. Moore?
Judge, it just still, our position is still that we would object that anything that he hears, the idea or the risk that he's going to change his testimony is too great for us to allow that risk. And given the fact that, like I said, he's already been deposed, we are prepared, we would certainly be prejudiced by any change in testimony at this point. And even the state can't say that that's not going to happen. So we would ask the court not to lift that rule and ask that he still be excluded.
All right, but what's your response to the state's argument under 90.616 sub 2 sub C, which does allow someone who is essential to the presentation of the party's cause? And is Mr. Nunnally's argument correct that that's been interpreted to allow experts to remain so that they could consult with attorneys on cross-examination and other purposes that have nothing to do with the expert's testimony?
Yes, the problem is that Dr. Pritchard, his commentary or involvement during Dr. McClain's testimony does have to do with his testimony. That's his entire purpose in testifying, is that he's going to rebut the things that she says, or that's his intention. And so I don't know how the court could be assured, or the state could be assured, that him sitting in here and listening to her testimony won't change what he's going to say. And while I understand that they have the right to consult, that right has to be tempered by the right of the defendant to due process and to be ensured that they have the opportunity to prepare for witnesses, which is clear that we're allowed to do under the discovery rules.
But Ms. Moore, would you agree that if the court sustains the defense objection, then the state will have no opportunity to use Dr. Pritchard as a consulting expert to assist with cross-examination and other purposes unrelated to the doctor's testimony? That would prohibit that.
Essentially, yes, I would agree that that would happen.
But if the court grants the state's request, isn't that a separate issue that's not before the court as to Dr. Pritchard's testimony, if it is in fact changed or altered by what he hears today?
I think that the court should consider it in making the decision now, because it would obviously change the scope of the trial later. However, I do agree that if his testimony changed, we would have to address it again at that point. But I don't believe that the court should ignore the risk or possibility that this would hinder or change his testimony.
All right. Well, looking under section 90.616 sub 2 sub C, it does allow, creates an exception to the rule of sequestration to include a person whose presence is shown by the party's attorney to be essential to the presentation of the party's cause. And that has been interpreted, just briefly reviewed Professor Earhart's treatise here while I was hearing the argument from the parties. And my recollection when I looked at this issue before is that that does specifically include the purpose that's been articulated by Mr. Nunnally. So I'm going to allow Dr. Pritchard to remain. I am specifically not addressing any other issue other than whether Dr. Pritchard can remain. I'm not addressing how that affects cross-examination by the defense of Dr. Pritchard, how it might affect other motions, testimonial issues when Dr. Pritchard takes the stand, or anything else other than the very narrow issue before me. Simply the fact, can he remain? And I'm going to grant that request and overrule that specific objection to that one issue by the defense.
Judge, may I be excused momentarily to inform Dr. Pritchard who can remain in the courtroom?
Oh, yes. I thought he was present in the courtroom, but certainly. All right, Ms. Moore, is defense ready to proceed?
Yes, Judge.
Mr. Nelson?
Yes.
Mr. Nunnally?
We are, Judge. Thank you.
All right, let's bring the jury, please. Good morning, members of the jury.
Good morning.
Ms. Moore, does the defense acknowledge the jury?
Yes, Judge.
Mr. Nelson?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Nunnally?
Yes, Judge. Thank you.
Ms. Moore, please call the next witness for the defense.
Yes, Judge, the defense would call Dr. Valerie McClain.
Thank you.
Do you solemnly swear the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Please state and spell your first and last name for Madam Court Reporter.
Yes, sir. Dr. Valerie R. McClain, Valerie McClain.
Thank you. Ms. Moore.
Yes, Judge. Dr. McClain, what do you do for a living?
I am a licensed psychologist in the state of Florida.
And can you briefly go through your educational background?
Certainly, I received my bachelor's, master's, and doctoral degree from Florida Tech in Melbourne, Florida. I completed my internship at Portland VA Medical Center in Portland, Oregon, specializing in post-traumatic stress disorder and neuropsychology. I completed my postdoctoral fellowship at the Rehab Hospital of the Pacific in Honolulu, Hawaii, specializing in rehabilitation, neuropsychology, and multicultural issues.
Have you ever been published in the field of forensic psychology?
I have.
Can you briefly tell us what forensic psychology is?
Certainly. Forensic psychology is basically an area of psychology that directly relates to how mental health issues impact psycholegal issues in the courtroom, such as competency to stand trial, mitigation, neuropsychological issues that might impact a person's ability to understand and process information. So essentially, it's the interface between the law and psychology.
And have you ever been published in the field of neuropsychology?
Yes, I have.
And have you been published in any other fields in psychology?
I have published in the area of guardianship matters, in the area of neuropsychology and neuroimaging, along with attorneys. I've also published in the area of intellectual disability, along with attorneys. My most recent publication was in the Toro Law Review. I also published a chapter within a handbook that addresses mitigation and death penalty cases.
In your current practice, what are your primary focuses?
My primary focus is, I would say, 90 to above % forensic work, exploring different areas of law and psychology, including mental health issues such as guardianship, probate matters, criminal law as far as being court appointed for competency matters. I also do work for attorneys on mitigation, as well as death penalty work. I also do a significant number of Miller-Graham cases as to juvenile resentencing.
And just to clarify that last piece, Miller-Graham is sort of a legal term for resentencing of juveniles, is that correct?
That is exactly correct.
Okay. What is, or can you briefly describe what neuropsychology is?
Certainly. Neuropsychology pertains to brain behavior relationships. Essentially, it's an area in which the psychologist would conduct testing and interviewing and also review documentation regarding medical issues, neurological issues, and then do an assessment essentially to determine if there are significant deficits with regard to the person's ability to pay attention, remember things, executive skills such as processing and planning or manipulating information. So it's an area of expertise that involves testing specific to brain function to determine the strengths and weaknesses of the individual.
And to clarify, do you have that area of expertise?
I do.
And what type of training and experience do you have that led you to that area, or to have that area of expertise?
Well, my internship, I studied with Diane Howison and Larry Binder and Lauren Pankratz, who were experts in the area of neuropsychology. And then I went on my postdoctoral fellowship and was supervised for that year as well by Dr. Yametsu and did rotations in basically head injury, stroke, or cardiovascular events that affected the person, also pediatric cases. I then went on to do further supervision with Dr. Theodore Blau, who was an ABAP or diplomate in clinical forensic and neuropsychology.
Have you ever testified in court before?
I have.
How many times?
I would say over 1,500 times.
And in all of those times, were you testifying as an expert witness?
I was.
You mentioned before, but just to clarify, some of those times include criminal cases, is that right?
That is correct.
And they also include other death penalty cases, is that right?
Yes.
Have you ever been hired by the state through the state attorney's office to consult, evaluate, or testify in a criminal case?
I am currently retained by the state in a case involving evaluation of a victim in a sex case. I was court appointed and ended up testifying for the state in another similar case that went to trial. I have evaluated individuals for competency, but that has been primarily court appointed, where the state reaches out to me through a court appointment and then asks that I conduct the evaluation.
And to clarify, what do you mean by court appointed?
Court appointed refers to when the judge is asked by the parties involved, defense and or state, or even court elects to have an individual evaluated if there is questions regarding the person's ability to understand essentially their rights as far as their understanding of their charges, the possible penalties, their understanding of the courtroom proceedings, and their ability to participate in a meaningful manner in the courtroom.
So to be clear, in your practice, you've been hired by the state attorney's office, by defense attorneys, and been appointed by the judge separately from both of those. Is that correct?
That would be correct.
When you became involved in Mr. Nelson's case, what were you requested to do?
I was requested to evaluate Mr. Nelson for the purposes of evaluating potential mitigating factors that would be important for sentencing.
Okay. And what materials did you review?
I was provided with documentation concerning jail records, concerning the Bureau of Prisons records. I had information with regard to his educational background. There was not much, but there was some documentation concerning his education. I also was provided with his audio to law enforcement, essentially when he's interviewed. So there was also family history with regard to his mother's mental illness. There was documentation provided concerning her mental illness. There was also documentation concerning his father's criminal record that was provided to me.
Besides reviewing all of those materials that we just went over, did you actually speak with Mr. Nelson?
Yes, and let me just include that aside from what I would call background materials, there were separate reports from other experts that were provided to me, including Dr. Ming, Dr. Pritchard, Dr. Woods, and Dr. Woe.
Okay. And you, in conjunction with their reports, you also got some raw data, is that right?
That is correct.
Okay, I'll come back to that. Is there anything else that you reviewed or had that we haven't mentioned?
Not to my knowledge, except for following a deposition, I was provided with a listing of the various placements as far as in the Bureau of Prisons for Mr. Nelson.
Okay. And you did actually speak with Mr. Nelson, correct?
I did.
How many times did you speak with him?
I spoke with Mr. Nelson on 2 occasions, May 15th, 2019, and also June 3rd, 2019.
Can you estimate about how long in total you spent talking with him?
I would estimate approximately 3 hours.
After you spoke with him, I know you mentioned receiving a listing of where he was housed. Did you speak with anyone else or do any follow-up after speaking with him?
No, the only additional thing that I did was to send a rating scale, if you will, for autism, called the Gilliam's Autism Rating Scale, to both his brother and one of his close colleagues. I did receive the rating scale back from his brother, James.
Okay. So I want to start if you could explain to us what the adverse childhood experience theory is.
Certainly. The adverse childhood experience theory essentially began as a cooperative or collaborative endeavor between Kaiser Permanente and the Center for Disease Control. It began in the early 90s. There's been subsequent studies and continue to be studies that explore the impact of aversive events such as, for instance, drug addiction in families, exposure of children to domestic violence or domestic abuse, exposure to disease, exposure to poverty, exposure to being belittled or themselves victimized. But it basically looks at how those various factors would impact a person's overall health and well-being, also longevity, and their psychological stability.
When you say longevity, you mean life expectancy. Is that accurate?
Correct.
And from those studies, have they found that there are effects of having experienced these adverse childhood experiences on the things you talked about, like life expectancy, mental stability, things like that?
Yes.
And what type of effects have they found?
Well, they found that it can affect, as far as their symptoms of illness, actual medical disease, illness, symptoms of heart disease, symptoms such as psychological impact, difficulties coping, depression. But there has been both the medical as well as psychological impact has been measured.
And before we go into the specific areas of this theory, can you tell us how trauma at a young age has shown to have effects on development?
Surely. In a real simplistic way, when a person is exposed to trauma, it affects their reaction, their understanding of their situation. There affects brain development. Areas of the brain are stimulated by trauma. Areas such as what we call the amygdala, site of arousal. And it basically leads to a panic mode or a fear mode of something bad's going to happen, leading to impact on the person, a young child in particular, their ability to learn in school, for example, their ability to retain information and pay attention. In other words, if they're being raised in an environment, for example, with domestic abuse, not knowing if they'll come home to their parent being abused, not knowing if they're going to come home and be abused themselves. So in other words, that sort of holding tank comes with them to the school setting, for example, to where you might notice, for instance, difficulties with learning, like a learning disability, where it might be an actual learning disability, but also might be that the psychological trauma is interrupting their ability to focus.
One thing you mentioned was the development of the brain in particular. I think you were talking about the amygdala. Can you tell us more about how trauma affects the development of the brain?
Sure. Trauma can impact the person's ability to basically develop at a normal rate. It can affect areas of brain function by overstimulating certain parts of the brain and overriding the person's ability to actually develop certain skills and cognitive abilities. For example, if the person is subjected to repeated trauma over a period of time, years, you may find that in that particular brain that there's areas that have been stunted, if you will. And it may show up as functional deficits. In other words, not being able to perform in certain areas that has more to do with the trauma as opposed to an actual deficit.
And is it fair to say that trauma causes actual changes in the brain? Like the brain is not developing the same as a normal person?
That's correct.
And you can see that on neuroimaging and things like that?
Yes.
So we've talked about how trauma can affect the development of the brain, but you also mentioned how it can affect mental health. Can you tell us a little more about that?
Certainly. Just as an example, a person who is exposed to, for example, domestic abuse by one spouse towards the other, to the extent that that person's life is threatened, such as holding a gun to the person, beating them, that the individual observing it, be it a child or another dog, perceives that, in fact, that person's life is in danger. And they have a reaction to it, an emotional reaction, a physical reaction, such as hypervigilance, muscular stimulation, the fear that something bad is going to happen, like a perceived threat, so that that individual observing or a part of actually being a victim will then store that memory and may have flashbacks and recurrent nightmares to the event. They can also start to avoid the situation where they don't want to go around where it occurred, such as in a motor vehicle accident. They may not want to drive where the accident occurred. They might want to avoid sounds and sights associated with the event. So it creates what we call a psychological symptomatology that may actually be full-blown post-traumatic stress.
The theory of adverse childhood experiences has sort of a checklist or a survey to go through. Is that correct?
Correct.
And can you tell us about that?
Certainly. With regard to the specifics, it does go through, and it will give you specific indicators such as the exposure of the individual as a child to trauma, for example, spousal trauma, observing the parent abusing the other parent. It also goes to the issue of exposure to humiliation, exposure to being belittled. There is exposure to whether or not the parents and or the caregiver is a substance user. In other words, the parent is unavailable because they're otherwise involved in using substances that cause them to not be able to focus on the individual who's developing. It also goes into areas of whether or not the person was exposed to someone who was so severely depressed, for instance, as a caregiver, that they were unable to take care of them. For example, if a person's hospitalized, a parent is institutionalized, they would not be able to be available. So those would be important factors. Just the basic tone of the family, the basic emotional tone, if there's a closeness in the family, as opposed to what I call a spiked ball, where everybody's going in their own direction, and there's not the feeling that they're part of that family, or that there is a significant amount of caring towards that person.
And this survey or questionnaire, did you do that with Mr. Nelson?
I did.
Okay. And on this survey, how many experiences do they suggest you ask about?
Well, basically what I do is I conduct the actual interview with...
Objection, non-responsive.
I'll sustain the objection.
When you are looking for or trying to determine if someone has had adverse childhood experiences, what do you do?
Basically, there's a checklist, and I utilize the checklist.
Okay. And how many things are on the checklist?
The checklist contains 10 items.
Okay. And did you do that checklist with Mr. Nelson?
I did.
How many of the 10 items did Mr. Nelson experience?
There were 9 out of 10 indicated.
Okay. And so I'd like to go through them if we can. So can you tell us what the first one that you believe Mr. Nelson experienced was?
Certainly. The first item, and this is couched within while you were growing up during your first 18 years of life. 1, did a parent or other adult in the household often swear at you, insult you, put you down, or humiliate you, or act in a way that made you afraid that you might be physically hurt?
And can you give us examples or what you know about Mr. Nelson's history that led you to believe that he'd experienced that?
Yes. With regard to particular individuals in the household, the father was identified as being a perpetrator on the mother and other siblings, including his brothers James and Robert. The father was described as an alcoholic who was emotionally abusive and physically abusive to the mother and his siblings. Mr. Nelson, there's a 7 to 8 year difference in his sibling age range. His brothers are older than he is. His brothers also engaged in physical abuse with him and humiliation.
The things that you just described, they were reported to you by Mr. Nelson, is that right?
That is correct.
Were they reported to you, or did you review anything else that gave you support that that had happened?
With regard to the information that I reviewed, it did include mitigation information that was provided to me that involved interviews with his brother James with regard to the father's behavior towards the mother, as well as the father's behavior towards the siblings.
So what was the second adverse childhood experience that you believe that Mr. Nelson has experienced?
Did a parent or other adult in the household often push, grab, slap, or throw something at you, or ever hit you so hard that you had marks or were injured? And the information provided was that at 12 years old, Mr. Nelson was given a black eye by his brother, Robert, and was also tied up in a chair, basically dressed in rags by James.
Did he ever describe an incident in which a pen was shoved into his throat?
He did.
And can you tell us about that?
He indicated that his stuffed animal was taken from him and that his brother told him the only way to get it back was to put a pen into his mouth. And when he put the pen into his mouth, he shoved the pen into Mr. Nelson's mouth.
And were you told that he needed medical treatment as a result of that?
Yes.
What was the third childhood experience or adverse childhood experience that you believe that Mr. Nelson experienced?
Did you often feel that no one in your family loved you or thought you were important or special, or your family didn't look out for each other, feel close to each other, or support each other?
Can you tell us what examples you have of that?
Certainly. With regard to Mr. Nelson's relationship with his siblings and his father, he described what I would call a distancing or an isolation. There was not time spent with them that would be what I would call bonding, playing soccer together, playing football together. He was, like, as I stated, 7 to 8 years younger than his brothers, and there really wasn't that type of camaraderie or let's go do something together. There was also a period of time in which his parents ran a store, basically when he was around 9 to 10 years old, and for a period of time there were no same-age peers available, but his parents were very preoccupied with the store and not available to him in terms of taking care of the basic needs like feeding him, taking time with him. They were very focused on running the store.
Did Mr. Nelson ever describe to you that he realized later in life or at an age that it was odd that his family didn't have the same sort of affectionate behavior that he's seen to other places?
Yes, he gave a specific example and said that in approximately 6th grade, he was invited to stay over at a friend's house or spend time at a friend's house, and he noticed that the parents treated the child with love and comfort and support, and it seemed odd to him and different from his own experience because in his family, that was not the way that they interacted.
What was the fourth adverse childhood experience that you noticed that Mr. Nelson had experienced?
Did you often feel that you didn't have enough to eat, had to wear dirty clothes, or had no one to protect you, or your parents were too drunk or high to take care of you or take you to the doctor if you needed it?
And can you give us some examples of why you felt that Mr. Nelson meets this adverse childhood experience?
Twofold. I do think that with regard to the history, father was a drinker and unavailable to him in terms of protection, not just towards Mr. Nelson, but also towards the mother and to the brothers. Also that basically his basic ability to count on being protected was not there.
And did he give you any examples of times that he was abused maybe by someone outside of the home that he didn't feel he was protected by his family members?
He did. There was one particular incident that was very, very traumatic to him. He was beaten up by an older boy. He was taken into the woods at approximately age 7 by a 15-year-old and beaten with basically a rubber whip, leaving welts and bruises. So at a very young age, there was physical trauma by an outsider.
What was the next childhood experience or adverse childhood experience that you believe Mr. Nelson experienced?
Were your parents ever separated or divorced?
Okay, and to your information, were they separated or divorced?
His parents did separate when he was approximately 12 years old.
And did he tell you any more or explain to you how that might have affected him?
There was a plan proposed by the father that a house was to be built and was in fact built, and that the family was going to live together in the home, but in fact that never occurred, and the father actually abandoned them at that point.
What was the next adverse childhood experience that you believe that Mr. Nelson experienced?
Was your mother or stepmother often pushed, grabbed, slapped, or had something thrown at her, or sometimes or often kicked, bitten, hit with a fist, or hit with something hard, ever repeatedly hit over at least a few minutes or threatened with a gun or knife?
And did Mr. Nelson give you specifics about his experience with that?
Yes, he did observe his father to kick his mother and to hold her at gunpoint.
And were those types of abusive situations, were those corroborated by his brother when you reviewed that interview?
Yes.
The next childhood experience that you believe Mr. Nelson experienced, what was that?
Did you live with anyone who was a problem drinker or an alcoholic or who used street drugs?
And I think we touched on this a little bit before. At least the father, you believe, was an alcoholic, and that's from Mr. Nelson and his brother. Is that correct?
That is correct. And there was also exposure to the use of marijuana and alcohol by his brothers.
Okay, so on this adverse experience, it wasn't just the father, but the brothers as well.
Correct.
And that was, when you say exposure, what do you mean by that?
Exposure meaning that because of the age difference, the brothers had already started using marijuana or alcohol, but he was introduced to those drugs by his brothers.
And what was the 8th adverse childhood experience that Mr. Nelson experienced?
Was a household member depressed or mentally ill, or did a household member attempt suicide?
And can you tell us what you know about that?
Yes. Mr. Nelson's mother was documented as having schizoaffective disorder / schizophrenia and was institutionalized for a period of time when he was approximately 2 years old.
Okay. And can you tell us what, I think you said schizoaffective as well as schizophrenia. Can you start with schizoaffective? What is that?
Schizoaffective disorder is a mood disorder that involves distinctive periods in which the person experiences depression and alternates with what we call hypomania, to include racing thoughts, pressured speech, insomnia. They may have grandiosity, and then there will be periods alternatively in which there's actually a psychotic episode where they may either have auditory or visual hallucinations and or become very delusional.
And how is that different from schizophrenia?
Schizophrenia would not include necessarily the components of the mood disorder with the alternating periods of depression and hypomania.
And when you are describing those criteria, just generally, how are mental illnesses diagnosed?
Well, mental illnesses are diagnosed according to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. We're now in version 5, and there will be a list of specific criteria or symptomatology that the person has to demonstrate in order to be identified and diagnosed as having that disorder.
So when you describe someone with either schizoaffective or schizophrenia disorder, can that include someone that has a good sense of humor?
Definitely.
And can someone with those types of disorders, when they're treated, are they capable of working?
Yes.
When someone has those types of disorders, can you describe what the difficulties would be for a caretaker for them, for that person?
One of the biggest difficulties is medication compliance. So if a caregiver is in the role of having to monitor the medication, that can be one of the biggest difficulties in terms of taking care of someone with a mental disorder. The other thing is just basically the social interaction, being able to be in a role that's reciprocal as opposed to having to direct the person to, for instance, do hygiene chores such as bathe, dress, and groom themselves, and or manage their own personal affairs such as financial matters. So it can be very difficult knowing if in fact they're in a place that's high enough functioning to do their basic, like, self-care and higher level activities of daily living.
And are you aware of a time period in which Mr. Nelson was essentially the caregiver for his mother?
To my understanding, after the parents separated, which was approximately when he was 12 years old, the brothers essentially were old enough to where they were relatively more independent, but he was in fact residing with his mother following the separation.
And those pressures or difficulties in taking care of an individual with a type of mental illness, that's the same as if they were an adult, as if that person was an adult, it would be that difficult to take care of. Is that,
Can you
I think I
repeat
said
that?
that poorly, I apologize. If an adult is a caregiver for someone with schizoaffective disorder or schizophrenia, those difficulties that you described, do they apply to that adult who's the caregiver?
Well, whoever is within the home or the dwelling in proximity to the person who's mentally ill, whether it's a child, teenager, or an adult, the challenges are still going to be there. It just depends upon the person's capacity to step to the plate and be able to do it.
And a child who is having to caretake for their mother, how is that more difficult?
Well, with regard to the child's set of skills, if you will, their ability to understand what's needed in the situation, it calls upon a higher level as far as putting their own developmental needs on the back burner to allow for taking care of the situation with the mentally ill significant other. In other words, whereas individuals in a home with two functional parents might be out like doing extracurricular activities, sports, going to proms, dances, different types of activities. Instead, that person may be trying to make ends meet, take on a job, make sure things are okay on the home front. So it's a whole different world for the person who's in the caregiver role.
Okay, so we'll come back to that a little bit. But what was the 9th adverse childhood experience that you believe that Mr. Nelson has experienced?
Did a household member go to prison?
Okay, and what is your information about that?
With regard to the documentation concerning his father's criminal history, his father was incarcerated for a period of time.
So Mr. Nelson experienced 9 of the 10 adverse childhood experiences on this survey. How, in your opinion, has that affected his mental health or development?
Specifically, with regard to his mental health and development, I do believe that there is significant instances in which he was exposed to life-threatening events and perceived life-threatening events for himself as well as his mother and or other siblings, and that has basically led to his development of mental health symptoms, including the diagnosis of depression, as well as post-traumatic stress disorder.
I'm going to come back to those things as well. But can you tell us a little more about, some lay people may believe, well, something happened in your childhood, you have to rise above and essentially get over it. How is that not possible for some people, or how is that more difficult for others?
Well, first and foremost, the main thing is if there hasn't, in fact, been any attempts for intervention or treatment. With regard to individuals subjected to trauma, many times they'll be referred for counseling. So an example would be somebody who's physically assaulted or raped. And they may in fact go through counseling, and the symptoms of post-traumatic stress can in fact go into remission. But absent that type of intervention, these types of events can repeatedly go through the person's mind, lead to a state of depression as far as not being able to protect themselves against the trauma, such as being physically assaulted or whipped, like in Mr. Nelson's case, and or exposed to events such as observing his mother being abused, where a person has no control over it, no ability to stop the bad event from occurring. In other words, there can be a learned helplessness that develops.
Okay. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you mean by learned helplessness?
Yes, I can. The research in psychology, there was a significant body of research concerning conditioning of an individual to become depressed, and over time, aversively triggering that response by shocking, for instance, an animal, so that when they would try to approach food, they'd be shocked. When they try to get out of a cage, they'll be shocked. So that eventually the animal would just basically sit still and not attempt to exit the cage and or attempt to get the food. The primary people who did the research were Seligman and Mayer, and two major figures in the area of psychology. Those studies turned out to be very important in terms of understanding how an individual, an adult, child, can in fact develop these symptoms like apathy, helplessness, hopelessness, why try, low motivation, because they've been conditioned to not be able to have control in their environment. In other words, they haven't been able to accomplish things, get the necessary praise and feedback, to feel motivated to do something with their life, and or just to basically go out in the world and function, such as forming effective social interactions with others.
Going along with this learned helplessness, can you tell us how a normal child or adult learns coping skills?
Well, typically a child is raised in an environment where one or both parents or caregivers will help them to effectively deal with frustration and emotion so that they can, for instance, take a deep breath, think it through, think this through with me, teaching them ways to even deal with physical anger, to like take time outs, to breathe. A common discipline technique is a timeout for a child, to get their bearings and be able to cope. So basically parents and or appropriate role models such as siblings would be there to be proactive and help the person to gain coping skills.
Do you have any information that leads you to believe that anyone taught Mr. Nelson any of these skills?
I do not have any information suggestive that he was taught by either his father or mother to cope with situations, stressful situations in particular. In talking with Mr. Nelson, one of the concerns he expressed about himself was that at an age where he would be learning those skills, for instance, 9, 10 years old, up into early teens, that his exposure at that point, for instance, when he was with his parents and they were running a store, was exposure to older peers, essentially not peers of his same age, so that at a certain point where he was supposed to go into the world, function effectively and cope, he expressed that he felt he had deficits with regard to how to function in the real world.
And can the combination of not having these coping skills and this learned helplessness make it more difficult for someone to recover from traumatic adverse childhood experiences?
Yes.
You were talking about intervention or treatment for someone who's had these type of experiences. Do you know if Mr. Nelson ever had any of those interventions or treatment?
With regard to treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder and depression, I do know that Mr. Nelson, when he was institutionalized, and I'm referring to imprisoned, that they did start him on medication to address his depression, and he was diagnosed with a mood disorder while incarcerated, but they did basically try to treat him with pharmacotherapy, with various antidepressant medications, as well as an antipsychotic medication and sleep medication.
And did he ever, to your knowledge, receive any sort of treatment or training on how to deal with post-traumatic stress disorder?
There is nothing in the record that suggests that there was classes for post-traumatic stress disorder. There was a period of time where he was enrolled in classes that were what we would call like cognitive type of therapy, but there's no specific reflection that he was treated for post-traumatic stress.
During his childhood or early adult, are you aware of any possible brain injuries that Mr. Nelson suffered?
I am.
And can you tell us about those?
Certainly. The first head injury that was reported was a bicycle accident in which he was hit by a car, and that would have been at 8 years old.
And was that, to your knowledge, did Mr. James Nelson, did he remember that or corroborate that?
Correct.
What other injuries are you aware of?
There was also a motor vehicle accident in which he was a passenger, in which his friend was drinking an excessive amount of alcohol, and basically they crashed into a police car and then into a house.
Okay. And are you aware of a police report or anything that suggests that that happened?
That's correct.
Okay. What was the next injury that you're aware of?
In talking with Mr. Nelson, there was also an incident in which he was punched in the head.
Okay. About what age was that?
In 1978, so he would have been approximately 14 or 15 years old.
Any other injuries to the head that you're aware of?
There was an accident, another accident in 1980, motor vehicle accident, and during the accident, he hit his head on the dashboard as well as the elbow of the driver hit him in the head.
Any others that you're aware of?
No, ma'am, other than in 2015.
Okay, and in 2015, we'll talk about that incident a little bit more, but can you just describe the head injury portion of that?
I guess that he was hit in the head during an assault while incarcerated.
And so you talked a little bit before the fact that you're a neuropsychologist and that you have that expertise. And you indicated you reviewed raw data from doctors, is that right?
Yes, raw data as well as the summary of their findings.
Okay. And after you reviewed that raw data, were you able to sort of formulate your own opinion about what type of, or if Mr. Nelson has any sort of deficits?
Yes.
Okay. And can you tell us what your opinion as to that was?
Yes, and this is based upon my review of data provided by Dr. Mings and also by Dr. Woe, who is a neuropsychologist. And that testing would be neuropsychological testing that examined Mr. Nelson's overall intellectual functioning as far as verbal skills, performance skills, processing speed, and working memory, as well as memory testing to look at his ability to learn new information and retain that information over time. There was also testing to examine what we call executive functioning, which is basically the driver of the brain, the part of the brain that plans, problem solves, and navigates information. And the results from the summaries, the results from the raw data do suggest that Mr. Nelson does have significant deficits in the areas of immediate delayed memory, specifically verbal memory. He also has basically deficits in the areas of what we would call higher level processing or executive deficits.
Okay. So let's talk about the executive deficits. And you said higher level of processing. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that means?
Certainly. Executive functioning refers to higher level brain functioning such as problem solving, planning, shifting from one idea or set of information to another set of information. So there's a series of tests that are done in order to examine whether or not the person can do those types of things, like shift from one thing to another, produce information out of memory, such as recalling information, plan and solve problems.
In practical, sort of everyday terms, how would these types of deficits be manifested? How would we notice that?
Well, one of the first things is that I call it sticky, basically. A person gets stuck, and it's hard to get them to shift out of one mode to the other mode. For instance, if they get fixated on an idea or they want to solve a problem a certain way, they don't entertain new information, for example, that might present a better problem-solving solution. So there can be deficits in that. There can be problems with them just not being able to think things through, sequencing. In other words, instead of going A, B, C, D, A to C or A to D, impulsivity, deficits as far as regulating their ability to process information.
And do you see those types of manifestations in Mr. Nelson?
Yes.
How do these deficits affect decision-making in particular?
Specifically in decision-making, the ability for Mr. Nelson to analyze the situation, problem solve rationally through the steps is affected by his history of executive deficits, meaning deficits due to repeated head trauma, resulting in areas of the brain being impacted by that trauma, but also exposure to trauma. As I discussed earlier with post-traumatic stress disorder, areas of the brain such as the amygdala and the arousal system, in situations where there is a perceived threat, that area is triggered. It overrides and makes it even worse for the person to problem solve and plan because they're re-triggered. In other words, it's bringing back past traumatic experiences such that the person short circuits, essentially. So it's a fight or flight type of response as opposed to effective problem solving.
So is it your opinion that the adverse childhood experiences and the cognitive deficits sort of make each other worse?
Well, I think that that's simply said, yes. I think that the environmental holding tank and the exposure, the psychosocial exposure, certainly impacted him, coupled with the fact that he did have a history of repeated head trauma.
Is there anything that we haven't talked about regarding brain damage or childhood trauma that you believe was important in your analysis of Mr. Nelson?
I don't believe so.
So I want to move on to your evaluation of Mr. Nelson when you said you provided records from the Federal Bureau of Prisons.
Correct.
You also spoke with Mr. Nelson about his experiences in prison, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So I'd like to start generally with what type of mental health effects do you see with individuals who serve long prison sentences?
Certainly. There's a body of literature, and I'm going to specifically refer to literature provided by Craig Haney, who is an author that addresses post-prison adjustment, impact of long-term incarceration, and goes through just specific psychological effects that can occur, behavioral effects that can occur for good and for bad.
And these types of psychological and behavioral effects, they can happen to a healthy person that goes into prison. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
Okay. And one of the factors in the literature that talks about whether someone is affected more negatively is about adjustment to prison life. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay. And can you talk about what type of factors affect an inmate's adjustment to prison life?
Certainly.
Can you tell us what those might be?
Well, I think the first and foremost factor is that each individual is different. The individual that's going into prison may have had no prior experience with be incarcerated may in fact not have had any type of mental health history. So that's one type of person. Another prisoner may have been institutionalized previously, have a history of, for instance, depression and or bipolar disorder, and therefore will have had the experience of their perception of what it will be like, the necessity of being on medication. But exposure to graphic incidents, for example, being physically assaulted, being threatened, being sexually assaulted, or seeing other people physically or sexually assaulted. In general, just the structure itself, because prisons can obviously offer a tremendous amount of structure as far as the rules, the regulations, when you have chow, when you go to sleep. So it's very similar to, for instance, military.
What about things like having contact with family members or being able to work inside the jail setting or prison setting? Did those affect someone's ability to adjust as well?
Certainly.
So I want to talk about Mr. Nelson a little more specifically. Based on your review of the records, are you aware that Mr. Nelson spent time in isolation?
Yes.
And according to the records, about how much time did he spend in isolation?
I'm not certain of the exact amount of time, but I do know he was in isolation for protective reasons as well as self-selection.
Okay. And that was for the majority of his incarceration, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. What type of mental health effects do you expect to see of an inmate who serves, almost 19 years in isolation?
Well, I think the primary impact is that being in isolation does not allow for the frequency of social interactions that you would see if someone is, in fact, has another cellmate or a bunkie. Basically, the opportunities for interaction are minimal. And the difficulty is that it doesn't allow the person and or force the person to engage, so that their skills, their set of social skills, is much more narrow and limited, and in some cases can be maladaptive.
In your review of the records, were there times that Mr. Nelson asked to go back to general population and wasn't allowed to do that?
Yes.
Okay. And there are also other times when he asked or did things to get put into segregation, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Did Mr. Nelson tell you about his experience when he was in isolation?
Yes.
And can you give us examples of things that happened to him or part of his experience that you believe had an effect on his mental health?
Well, I think the majority of the time spent in isolation, he was to himself and depressed, described himself as depressed, and that it basically led to ruminating and at times becoming suicidal.
And did he also tell you about times when he was sort of isolated with individuals who are actively psychotic or dangerous or things like that?
He did.
And what type of effects does that have on Mr. Nelson?
Just with his description, specific to his description, was the fear that he was left in a cell with a maniac, basically is the way he described it, and that his fear was that he would be harmed.
And did he talk about generally the conditions regarding lighting or heat or anything like that and how that affected him?
Well, I had reviewed the Bureau of Prisons records that specifically described when he would become overwhelmed with the heat in and of itself, and very frustrated, very overwhelmed by the heat itself, and feeling desperate, basically, to have that changed.
And did he describe times to you when the lights were left on for days and weeks at a time and never turned off?
Yes.
And did he describe times to you when it was so hot he had to lay on the cement to try to get some sort of decrease in temperature?
Yes.
And did he describe times when he was I think you said sometimes he was completely alone in the cell, correct?
Correct.
And other times that there were two or one or two other people that were in that small area with him. Is that right?
That's correct.
In the records, are you aware of, and we touched on this briefly, an incident in 2015 that involved a sexual assault against
Yes.
Mr. Nelson? And can you tell us a little bit about what you know of that?
Mr. Nelson described that he, in fact, had been hit in the back of the head, lost consciousness, and was sexually assaulted.
And that was by another inmate?
Correct.
And did he tell you what happened as a result of that, or if he reported it, or anything along those lines?
He did not.
Okay. And we talked about post-traumatic stress disorder a little bit already, and that you believe that based on his childhood experiences that he has post-traumatic stress disorder. Do you believe that any of these incidents that we are talking about his time in the Federal Bureau of Prisons has resulted in post-traumatic stress disorder?
Well, I think the underpinnings, the foundation for post-traumatic stress for Mr. Nelson began in his childhood. Specifically the abuse by his brothers, but also when he was taken into the woods at 7 years old and whipped by a 15-year-old. So I think that the foundation for the post-traumatic stress began in childhood. I think that it was worsened, if you will, by the prison experiences and the sexual assaults that occurred in prison, and the attempted sexual assault.
And so you indicated one actual sexual assault, and you believe that there was a second incident that involved an attempted sexual assault. Is that correct?
Yes.
So there's at least two incidents, separate incidents that you're aware of.
To my knowledge, yes.
Is hypervigilance a common side effect of PTSD?
Hypervigilance is one of the diagnostic criteria associated with post-traumatic stress.
Can you tell us what that is?
Certainly. Hypervigilance is when the person is basically monitoring the environment and scanning for potential threats.
And I don't know if this is the right way to word this, but can that be more difficult or worse when there are actual threats around you?
Well, essentially, if a person who has post-traumatic stress is housed in an environment in which there are actual threats, so the perception is there are actual threats, basically they stay in a constant state, more or less a constant state of hypervigilance.
And because of that hypervigilance or anything else affect, the mental health effects that Mr. Nelson has, does it surprise you that he would ask at times to return to the segregation housing unit?
No.
And why not?
Basically, what it does is it allows the person to decrease the perceived threats, to decrease the stimulation, if you will. And so it's basically a way to try to control the agitation and control the irritability.
And so if someone, even if those conditions are awful that he is asking to return to, if it's perceived to be safer for whatever reason, that would explain him asking to go back. Is that fair?
Well, I think it's definitely one explanation.
So we've been talking about a lot of these mental health effects. Are there indications in the records that Mr. Nelson was having these types of effects while he was incarcerated?
Oh, yes.
And can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, there are specific references by the Bureau of Prisons, by the staff, as early as 2004, documenting that Mr. Nelson would have periods of high anxiety, irritability, even paranoia, that he was going to be victimized or was being victimized, and that he would become agitated and engage in self-injurious behaviors, such as headbanging, hitting himself, or other self-destructive gestures. And the specific entries also detail how to approach Mr. Nelson.
And in the records, are there times that Mr. Nelson was a suicide risk?
Yes,
Are there specific mental health diagnoses?
he is diagnosed with a mood disorder and depression.
Okay. Besides, actually, I think we talked about that already. You talked about that he was given psychotropic medication. Is that correct?
Correct.
And when did that begin?
The records reflect approximately 2003 that he began to receive medication, which would have been the first such time when he was prescribed medication.
Okay. Is it your opinion that the effects of isolation and, well, let me ask you it this way. What is your opinion about the combination of the effects of being isolated, the abuses while incarcerated, the cognitive deficits that he has, and the traumatic experiences as a child?
Well, I think essentially the foundation of his, I'll say his developmental upbringing, basically put him in a place where there's already identified depression, as well as exposure to traumatic incidents, leading to symptoms of post-traumatic stress. With regard to the fact that he didn't have any specific therapy to deal with either and develop coping skills to manage it, for example, cognitive behavioral skills of this is how you're perceiving it, let's alter your perception. You know, something as practical as that. I know you're anxious, let's take deep breaths. So in other words, the absence of therapy, the absence of coping skills place him in a more vulnerable position such that his adaptation or lack thereof during institutionalization is going to be made worse and leave him with even less coping skills.
In the Federal Bureau of Prison Records, there is a notation or diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder. Is that correct?
Correct.
How is antisocial personality disorder properly diagnosed?
Well, in the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual 5, they do list specific criteria that would involve behavioral components with the onset beginning at age 15 years old.
And do you know of any evidence in Mr. Nelson that he had this behavioral symptoms or onset at age 15?
The records do not reflect that he had interactions with the juvenile justice system or the law, nor that he was demonstrating behaviors that are commonly associated with conduct disorder or antisocial, such as animal cruelty, abusing others. So there is no records that I saw that suggest that prior to the age of 15 and or 18 that he was exhibiting those type of behaviors.
Additionally, under the DSM, in order to diagnose antisocial personality disorder, there's another criteria involving that it not be related to bipolar disorder or schizophrenia. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And has Mr. Nelson been diagnosed with either of those?
The records from the Bureau of Prisons reflect that he's been diagnosed with a mood disorder, depression, as well as had periods where there's distinctive psychotic episodes involving paranoia for his staff, fears that he's going to be harmed or that there is a plan to harm him. So he definitely is exhibiting symptoms that are consistent with bipolar disorder.
And can you generally tell us what bipolar disorder is?
Certainly. Bipolar disorder is a mood disorder that involves distinctive episodes of depression, such as depressed mood, changes in appetite or sleep, feelings of worthlessness, low motivation, possibly suicidal ideation or thoughts, alternating with then episodes of mania, where the person may not sleep at all, where there's grandiosity or the belief they can do anything. There may be pressured speech. They may engage in excessive sprees, such as drug sprees or spending sprees.
Are irritability and impulsivity examples of mania?
Yes.
So To your knowledge, there's no evidence of a conduct disorder before the age of 15, and his symptoms cannot be separated from bipolar disorder. Is that correct?
Not in my opinion, no.
Okay. And so based on that, is antisocial personality disorder a proper diagnosis under the DSM-5?
Well, the DSM-5 has like A, B, and C clusters, if you will. And so antisocial falls within an area that's grouped together, such as other diagnoses, such as borderline personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder. But I don't think that the diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder encapsulates the group of symptoms that are observed in Mr. Nelson.
Before diagnosing a specific personality disorder, is it important to rule out other possible problems?
Yes, other possible issues as well as possible diagnoses.
Why is it important to rule those out before we jump to personality disorder?
Well, because the person is basically going to be viewed within that context or that disorder when they're being treated. So it's important, for example, within that same cluster, a person who has borderline personality disorder requires completely different treatment. In other words, there's components of borderline personality disorder that would be wrongly treated or improperly treated if that person were labeled, for example, antisocial personality disorder.
And is that the same, is that true of if you are treating for a personality disorder, you're not accurately treating for a mental illness like bipolar disorder or something like that?
Well, it's a very good question. Essentially, a person can have a personality disorder and a clinical syndrome or disorder such as bipolar disorder. Parts of the clinical syndrome or mood disorder may even mimic borderline personality components, such as being very dramatic. If the person's in a manic phase, they're obviously going to appear very dramatic, but they can have both things. They can have, borderline personality disorder plus bipolar disorder.
What are the other rule outs for these personality disorders besides bipolar disorder that we've talked about? What are other things that you should check on?
Well, within that, that cluster, as far as personality disorders, narcissism, borderline personality disorder, obviously antisocial personality disorder we've talked about. There are components of Mr. Nelson's personality that mimic, for instance, schizotypal or schizoid, basically being very paranoid at times, like paranoid personality disorder. So I think there are components of possibly 2 different clusters for Mr. Nelson, maybe even 3 with the anxiety component and dependency. But the main thing is that there is an overlying mood disorder that is being treated. In other words, his ability to cope, his ability to function, if those medications are taken away, is greatly reduced. So there is a daily difficulties for him just with regard to the depression and the mood disorder.
You had mentioned sending something to his brother and to a colleague about autism spectrum disorder.
Correct.
How is autism spectrum disorder diagnosed?
Well, essentially, autism spectrum will be diagnosed in the developmental window from the time basically a child's born until 18 years old. And at times it's diagnosed as an adult. But it consists of various components. There will be very specific types of behaviors observed, repetitive, obsessive type of behaviors, becoming fixated on certain toys or certain objects or sounds. Social interaction is greatly reduced or greatly marked by difficulties with understanding social situations and initiating or responding to social situations, even to the point of not appreciating or desiring to have feedback from others or not understanding it.
And did you sent out this questionnaire to his brother and to the other, is that because you had concerns or thought that was a possible diagnosis for Mr. Nelson?
My concern was specific to the social or lack of social skills, and just trying to rule out, because I do pretty extensive work with developmental disabilities, and so I always try to rule in or out that there might be some onset of a developmental disorder. Now, in reviewing the limited school records, I did not see anything that suggested an individual education plan for autism. I did see certain behaviors in Mr. Nelson that were suggestive of social isolation or atypical type behaviors, but essentially it was just to gather more information if in fact there was something blatant or glaring that I didn't want to miss.
And just so the jury is clear, some people may have heard of Asperger's syndrome. Under the DSM-5, that's included as part of autism spectrum disorder, is that right?
Yes, they no longer differentiate, if you will. There's a body of literature that teases out Asperger's from autism, but it's basically called what is on a spectrum, to where a person can be of average intelligence, functional, holding a job, able to be married and have children. So it's not the extreme that you might see with mutism, where someone's autistic and they engage in a lot of rocking behavior and have to be institutionalized. So the spectrum is really the spectrum.
Ms. Moore?
Yes.
Members of the jury, in just a moment, we're going to take a brief recess. During the recess, you're going to leave your notepads and your pens here. During the recess, you're under all the court's instructions, including but not limited to the instruction not to discuss this case amongst yourselves or with anyone else. Please follow the deputy in the jury room. We'll bring you back as quickly as we can. Thank you. Jury exiting. All right, we'll be in a brief recess. Doctor, if you need to use facilities, feel free.
Oh, thank you, Your Honor.